Welcome back, guys. Now we are continuing our exercise video series. We've covered the principles behind exercise, we've covered carb strategies, we've covered background insulin. Now we're looking at rapid insulin adjustment. Now this really is the nitty gritty, and particularly if you inject insulin, this is probably going to be your primary management strategy alongside eating carbohydrates to fuel the exercise. Now with rapid insulin, there's a lot of variables that can feed into this about what you should do. And what the main variable is how much insulin on board you have. So IOB, insulin on board. So it's all going to depend on when you're taking your rapid insulin doses and how long the exercise has an effect after your meals, that EPOC effect. If you remember EPOC from our first video about the prolonged effect of exercise after you've stopped doing it. So we need to look at different time points with exercise about when you've taken your insulin prior to that session and then afterwards to decide what you're going to do with it. So let's start with the first occurrence then. So if you're taking your insulin 3 to 5 hours before you exercise, we know that rapid insulin only has a lifespan of about 4.5 hours. So really, if it's over 4.5 hours before the meal, you don't need to do anything because the insulin's done its job and it's gone out of your system, so you don't need to worry about it. So actually the best time to exercise from a type 1 diabetes perspective is to exercise when you have no rapid insulin in your system. First thing in the morning before you've eaten, or have your breakfast, wait 4.5 hours, let that have its effect, then exercise. So the less insulin you have on board, the easier it is to manage. But that's not always the most practical thing for real life. If you're getting more to the 3-hour side of things, then you might shave off a little bit of the dose, but actually I think you'll probably be all right to take your normal dose or maybe just reduce by a unit or two to what you'd usually calculate. Because obviously if you underdose it by too much, that's quite a long time to start having not enough insulin in your body. 3 hours with a meal, you're going to be quite high by the time you actually get round to exercising. So it'll probably be easier to take your full dose and actually just have a little bit of carbohydrate during the session to prop you up. If you're exercising 2 hours, or 2 to 3 hours, 2 hours before the meal, then there's a few different considerations we need to think about because obviously that's only 2 hours into its lifespan. We've still got 2 to 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours of insulin left to go. So the first thing we can do is actually think about maybe having a lower carb meal so you've got less insulin on board. And actually, just anecdotally, when you have lower carb meals, it's easier to calculate, you know where you stand with your insulin, so you've got less chance of getting the dose wrong. Now, of course, the counter argument is if you have less carb, you've got less propping up your glucose levels. But if you're taking insulin for that, it's neither here nor there because the insulin's there to counteract the carbohydrates. So lower carb is one option. Another option is lower glycemic index foods, and what are you eating them with? That fat and protein that helps to slow it down. And the reason this can help is because even though your insulin is in and out in 4.5 hours, lower GI foods, particularly those really slow releasing foods, paired with fat and protein and fiber, may have a prolonged effect. They might not be absorbed completely within 4.5 hours. So although the insulin stops the initial spike, you still have some glucose being released into your system through the exercise session, which keeps you propped up nicely. The other option is having no carb. Now this does come with a risk of hypos because obviously, one, you're depleting your stores of stored carbohydrate as glycogen, so less stored carbohydrate in your body, more chance of hypos. And obviously then, if you're particularly running quite tightly, you could just trickle into a hypo. So you might need to still take some carbohydrates on board during the session, but obviously if you have a no carb meal or do it fasted, then you've got no additional insulin on board. So it can work quite nicely. The other thing you can do is just take a normal insulin dose, but reduce whatever you calculate from your carbohydrates and your correction by 25%. So shave off 25% from what you were going to take for the carbs. And same thing with a correction dose, but we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. You can also add in some carbohydrates, so you could just take your normal insulin dose, but then just make sure you're fueling yourself, aiming for that 20 to 60 grams per hour. Or you can do a combination of all. Like I say, it's all about testing and finding how you respond. And all of this stuff is in your online plan that's in the members area. So if you want to double check this or go through it again, it's all there written down for you. So that's the first bit. Next variable is what to do if you're exercising 30 to 60 minutes before the session. So again, lots of different variables here. So if you're exercising under 30 minutes total, 30 to 60 minutes before, after you've taken your insulin, 30 to 60 minutes before the session, but you're only exercising for under 30 minutes at a low intensity. Are you really nearly going to reduce your insulin dose? Probably not. Maybe take off 20% to be safe. We'd rather you went a little bit high than hypoed. That one will really just come from experience, what you need to do with that one. If you're exercising for 30 to 60 minutes for a medium to high intensity, it's going to vary. You might take 50% off your dose because you are literally banging the insulin action here. If you're going to do like a spin class, which would be about 45 minutes, that's high intensity. You might need to take up to 75% off that dose. And obviously, if you're getting on the bike or you're doing your exercise class or whatever it might be quite soon, so you know that you're going to be exercising within 30 to 60 minutes after you've taken your insulin, then there's not much chance for the glucose to get too high before it's too late. So the exercise will take effect before things get out of hand. So it's quite a nice scenario in that respect. But you might need to shave off up to 75% of that insulin dose. But that reduction won't have too much of an impact in terms of going high prior to the exercise because there's just not enough time for that to happen. If you're exercising for over 60 minutes at all intensities, you know, the range can be from 20% up to, with some people, I've seen 100%. They've not had to take their insulin dose at all because the exercise covers it. Again, it comes from experience. I'd probably still take some to start with, maybe take 75% off your normal dose. But you'll soon find out whether or not you need to take insulin and whether or not you're fighting to keep your glucose levels up. If that's the case, then yes, I do know some people, to be fair, it's usually athletes who do not need to take their rapid insulin if they're doing long duration, lots of activity. Afterwards, so like we said, we got that epoch effect. So exercise continues to take an effect well after the session is done. That's directly correlated to the duration of the exercise and also the intensity of the exercise. So what we can do is we can do 20 to 50% off your usual dose for your carbohydrates, okay? So calculate your carbohydrates. Let's say you got 6 units. You might take anywhere between 20% off 6, what's that? 0.6, 1.2. So you might take 5 units instead, or if you took up to 50% off, you take 3 units instead, allowing for the exercise to compensate for the rest of the insulin that's not there. In terms of your corrections, so if you're doing before exercise, particularly in the 30 to 60 minute area or 2 hours that you've taken your insulin prior to exercise, then you might take 25 to 50% off your usual correction dose. So if you worked out you need 4 units to correct yourself, only take 2 if you're doing 50%. After exercise, only take 30% of your usual correction dose afterwards. So you're not shaving 30% off, you're only taking 30%. So the other way of writing that would be take off 70%, okay? Now again, testing will soon reveal whether or not that is the correct thing to do and how much you need to reduce that by, but that's a good starting point because like I say, avoiding hypos is the name of the game. We can deal with a little bit of high for a while, particularly if exercises have an effect because even highs will soon correct. And if they don't, you can add in another correction 4.5 hours later to sort it out. Now, the other thing we haven't spoke about yet is HIIT exercise. So those high intensity spikes. So they can be really annoying for exercisers because they come into a sport or a competition even, or they're actually just doing a high intensity weight session or something and their glucose levels shoot right up and it makes them feel lousy, they don't feel great. It kind of hinders the session and in some instances completely makes it a non-starter. So in those instances, the first thing to know is whether or not that is a repeatable pattern. If it is every time you do it, then we know we have a pattern, it happens, day in, day out. In which case, we can add in what we call a micro correction prior to the session, literally just before it to help compensate for the spike that's going to come, that you know is going to come because you've got the data to prove it. We only need a couple of units, 2 units to help do this. So we're not looking for a full correction. So if you're running at 18, we're not looking to get back to 8 necessarily because the exercise will help you get there. So just take a couple of units, maybe drop you from 18 down to 16 or down to 14 and then let the exercise do the rest because regardless whether it's HIIT or cardio, even HIIT, you get the spike initially, but it will drop off soon. It will drop off soon enough after the session. So you can take a micro correction, but after that or during the session, you may need to take some carbs on board to compensate for then that EPOC effect and those GLUT4 receptors transporting glucose into your cells. So it's kind of a double-pronged effect, micro correction, but then feeding yourself a little bit to prevent any hypos if you find yourself dropping. That's where things like scanners and the continuous glucose monitors really come in handy, because you literally have a graph of what's happening. Otherwise you're having the finger prick test, which isn't ideal, but it's well worth doing in this context. There's also a couple of non-food and insulin related things you can do. So we know that high intensity training increases your glucose levels. So if you're conscious of hypos, then if you've done a long cardio session, literally just do a little bit of HIIT at the end of the session, sprint on the spot, lift some weights very quickly, just to get a little spike of glucose before you leave the gym or whatever it might be. And then you've got a little spike, and then you can go home and start doing your other insulin adjustment or carbohydrate loading strategies. And it works the other way around as well. So if you've done a high intensity training session and you've got a spike, you can always do cardio afterwards just to take the edge off and help bring it down. So it's almost like a correction without actually using insulin. But the most important thing of all this, and I hope you can see this, sometimes the board gets cut off at the bottom, is to monitor, get the patterns, establish the patterns that are happening with your glucose levels around this, because really it's in the data. That's how we manage it. So type 1 diabetes, it's all about the data and how organized you are with it, because then it gives you something to work off. It gives you numbers, it gives you patterns, and then you can act accordingly. So there's quite a lot of information there, guys. Like I say, really encourage you to check if you want to just go over the notes on this, look at the plan where it's all written for your reference, and sometimes just to go over it and consolidate it in words helps, or just rewatch the videos. Kind of a whistle-stop tour, but some of these strategies are really useful, and just from my experience have really helped people manage their type 1 diabetes around exercise. So we'll leave it there again, and I'll see you at the next lesson.